It was supposed to be just another night in September 1983. Across the Soviet Union, people were sleeping. Children dreamed peaceful dreams. Parents rested after long days of work. The world turned, as it always had, seemingly safe and secure. But in a secret bunker, buried deep beneath the forests outside Moscow, one man was about to face an impossible decision. A decision that would determine whether humanity would see another sunrise. His name was Stanislav Petrov, a 44-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces. And on this night, September 26, 1983, the fate of the entire world would rest on his shoulders. This is not the story you've been told about the Cold War. This isn't about the Cuban Missile Crisis that everyone knows. This is about the night that almost no one knows about. The night when nuclear war was not just possible, it was seconds away. This is the story of the night the world almost ended. To understand how close we came to annihilation, you need to understand 1983. This wasn't just another year of Cold War tensions. This was the most dangerous year in human history. Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, a former actor turned politician who called the Soviet Union an evil empire. His rhetoric was harsh, his military buildup was massive, and the Soviets were terrified. In Moscow, an elderly and paranoid Soviet leadership watched with growing fear. Yuri Andropov, the new Soviet premier and former head of the KGB, genuinely believed that America was preparing to launch a surprise nuclear first strike. He wasn't entirely wrong to be worried. The United States had recently deployed Pershing II missiles in West Germany. These weren't ordinary missiles. They could reach Moscow in less than 10 minutes. The Soviets would have almost no time to respond to an attack. Earlier that same month, September 1983, Soviet fighters had shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing all 269 passengers, including a United States congressman. The world was outraged. Reagan called it an act of barbarism. Tensions between the superpowers reached levels not seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But there was something else, something the public didn't know. The Soviets had initiated a secret program called Operation RYAN, a Russian acronym for Nuclear Missile Attack. Its purpose was to detect any signs that the United States was preparing to launch a first strike. Soviet intelligence officers around the world were ordered to watch for signals, unusual movements of government officials, changes in blood bank reserves, lights burning late in Western military headquarters. The KGB was so convinced an attack was coming that they were seeing threats everywhere. In this atmosphere of paranoia and fear, mistakes became catastrophic. And on the night of September 26th, the Soviet early warning system was about to make the deadliest mistake in human history. Serpukhov 15. That was the code name for one of the Soviet Union's most secret facilities. Located about 60 miles south of Moscow, this underground bunker was the heart of the Soviet early warning system. Inside this bunker, dozens of military officers worked in shifts, monitoring computer screens 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Their job was simple but terrifying: watch for any signs of an American nuclear launch. The system they used was called OKO, Russian for eye, a network of satellites orbiting high above the Earth, designed to detect the heat signature of American missiles launching from their silos. If the satellites detected launches, they would send a signal to Serpukhov 15, and then the officers would have to decide, was it real or was it a false alarm? On the night of September 26th, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer. He was filling in for a colleague who was sick. In his own words, he later said he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Petrov was not a typical Soviet officer. He was an engineer by training, not a military man. He understood the technical systems better than most. He knew their weaknesses, their flaws, their potential for error. And he was a thoughtful man, not quick to jump to conclusions. The bunker was deep underground, protected by meters of concrete and steel. The air was stale, recycled. The lighting was harsh fluorescent. Computer screens glowed in the darkness. The only sounds were the hum of machinery and the quiet conversations of officers monitoring their stations. It was just past midnight. Petrov was drinking tea, reviewing reports. Another long night shift. Nothing unusual, nothing to suggest that in just a few minutes, everything would change. At 12:14 a.m., the alarm went off. Not a quiet beep, not a subtle warning, a screaming, blaring siren that filled the entire bunker. Red lights began flashing across every console. Officers jumped to their feet. Teacups were forgotten. Every eye turned to the main display screen. On the screen, in bright red letters, were the words every person in that bunker had been trained to fear. Launch. Missile attack. The computer system was reporting that the United States had just launched a nuclear missile, one missile, heading toward the Soviet Union. Petrov's heart was pounding. His training kicked in. He looked at the data streaming across his screens. The satellite had detected a bright heat signature rising from a location in the United States. The trajectory calculations were being processed. The computer confidence level was reading highest reliability. One missile. Petrov's mind raced. This didn't make sense. If the Americans were going to launch a first strike, why would they launch just one missile? The United States had thousands of nuclear weapons. A real attack would involve hundreds, maybe thousands of missiles launched simultaneously to overwhelm Soviet defenses. But the computer was insistent. Launch, missile attack. The system had never been wrong before in training exercises. It was designed to be accurate, to be trusted. Petrov had less than 5 minutes to make a decision. Soviet military doctrine was clear. If an American nuclear attack was detected, the Soviet Union would immediately launch a massive retaliatory strike. Every missile, every bomb, everything the Soviets had would be launched at the United States and its allies. This was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. If you attack us, we will destroy you. Even if we are dying, no one wins. Everyone loses. Petrov had to report to his superiors, to the Soviet military command, to the generals who would make the final decision to launch. He reached for the phone. His hand was shaking, but something stopped him. Wait, he thought, this doesn't make sense. Then the alarm went off again. A second missile detected, then a third, a fourth, a fifth. 5 American nuclear missiles, according to the computer system, were now heading toward the Soviet Union. The bunker descended into controlled chaos. Officers were shouting, phones were ringing. The procedures were clear. Report the attack immediately. Let the leadership decide. That wasn't Petrov's job. His job was to pass on the information. But Petrov hesitated. Something felt wrong. His engineering instincts were screaming at him. 5 missiles? Still not enough for a real first strike. And there was something else. The satellites were reporting launches, but other systems, ground-based radars, were showing nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had seconds to decide. Report an attack and potentially start World War III, or trust his instincts and risk being wrong, risking that millions of Soviets would die because he failed to report a real attack. Later, Petrov would say that he made his decision based on a funny feeling in his gut. But it was more than that. It was experience. It was knowledge of the system's flaws. It was understanding that the satellite system used infrared detection, which could be fooled by clouds, by reflections, by optical illusions. Petrov picked up the phone, but instead of reporting an attack, he reported a system malfunction. False alarm, he told his superiors. Do not launch. The officers around him stared in disbelief. The computer was saying attack, the alarms were screaming, and Petrov was saying malfunction? The next 15 minutes were the longest of Stanislav Petrov's life, and possibly the longest 15 minutes in human history.
He had reported a system malfunction, but he wasn't certain. He was sweating. His hands were shaking. What if he was wrong? What if American missiles really were coming, and he had just prevented the Soviet Union from defending itself? The ground-based radars still showed nothing. If missiles had really been launched from the United States, the radars should be detecting them by now. But there was nothing. Empty screens, clear skies. Petrov watched the clock. 5 minutes passed, then 10. If the missiles were real, they would be getting close to Soviet territory. The radars absolutely should have detected them by now. Around him, the bunker had gone quiet. Everyone was watching, waiting. Some officers were praying. Others were staring at their screens, willing the radars to remain empty. 15 minutes, 20 minutes, still nothing on the ground radars. The satellite system finally stopped alarming. The computer analysis was beginning to show inconsistencies. The infrared signatures were fading in ways that didn't match real missile launches. Petrov allowed himself to breathe. It had been a false alarm. The satellites had detected something, probably sunlight reflecting from high-altitude clouds, and misidentified it as missile launches. The computer, with all its sophisticated programming, had made a mistake. But what if Petrov had been wrong? What if he had reported an attack? The Soviet military leadership would have had minutes to decide whether to launch their own missiles. In that atmosphere of paranoia, with Operation Ryan telling them the Americans were preparing to strike, with the shoot-down of the Korean airliner just weeks before, they almost certainly would have launched.
Thousands of Soviet nuclear missiles would have been fired at the United States, at NATO bases in Europe, at American allies around the world. Within 30 minutes, American early warning systems would have detected the Soviet launches. The United States would have launched its own massive retaliatory strike. Within an hour, every major city in the Northern Hemisphere would have been destroyed. Washington, New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Leningrad, gone, vaporized in nuclear fireballs, reaching temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun. The immediate deaths would number in the hundreds of millions, but that would only be the beginning. The nuclear explosions would have thrown billions of tons of ash and smoke into the atmosphere. The sun would have been blocked. Temperatures would have plummeted. Nuclear winter would have descended on the planet. Crops would have failed worldwide. Billions more would have died from starvation and cold. Human civilization, built over thousands of years, would have collapsed in a single night. Perhaps humanity itself would have gone extinct. All of this was prevented by one man, in one moment, trusting his instincts over a computer. When his shift ended at 8 a.m., Stanislav Petrov left the bunker exhausted. He had prevented World War III. He had saved potentially billions of lives. He was a hero. Except nobody treated him like one. The Soviet military was embarrassed. Their sophisticated early warning system, which had cost billions of rubles to develop, had failed catastrophically. And worse, one of their officers had defied the system, had trusted his own judgment over the computer. In the Soviet Union, that kind of independent thinking was dangerous. The communist system demanded obedience to authority, to the chain of command, to the technology the state provided. Petrov had broken that chain. An investigation was launched, not into why the system failed, but into whether Petrov had followed proper procedures. They examined every decision he made that night. They questioned his loyalty. They suggested he might have been too slow to respond, too hesitant, too willing to doubt Soviet technology. Petrov was not punished officially, but he was not rewarded either. No medal, no commendation, no recognition. Instead, he was transferred to a less important position. His career advancement stopped. The message was clear. What he had done was not to be celebrated. He was warned never to speak about that night. National security, they told him. State secrets.
The incident was classified at the highest levels. The Soviet leadership didn't want anyone to know how close they had come to accidentally starting a nuclear war. It would make them look weak, incompetent, vulnerable. For years, Petrov kept silent. He continued his military service, but the joy was gone. He knew what he had done. He knew he had made the right decision. But he also knew that in the eyes of his superiors, he had done something unforgivable. He had thought for himself. The Soviet system did eventually acknowledge the satellite malfunction. Changes were made to the early warning protocols. Additional layers of verification were added. The procedures that required immediate reporting of any launch detection were modified to allow for more analysis, more time to verify. But these changes were made quietly, internally. The Soviet public never knew. The American government never knew. The world never knew that on September 26, 1983, humanity had been seconds away from annihilation. Petrov retired from the military in 1984, taking early retirement. He moved to a small town outside Moscow. He lived quietly on a modest pension. He kept his secret for over a decade. The story might have ended there. Stanislav Petrov might have lived and died in obscurity, his incredible act of courage unknown to history. But in 1998, 15 years after that September night, the secret finally came out. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991. The Cold War was over. Many classified documents were being declassified. Russian military officers who had emigrated to the West began telling stories that had been suppressed for decades. A retired Soviet colonel named General Yuri Votintsev was being interviewed about the early warning system. He mentioned, almost casually, the incident in 1983 when the system had malfunctioned and nearly caused World War III. He mentioned Petrov's name. Western journalists picked up the story. They tracked down Petrov, who was by then living in a small apartment outside Moscow on a pension of about $200 a month. They knocked on his door and asked him to tell them about the night he saved the world.
At first, Petrov was reluctant. The habit of secrecy was hard to break. But eventually, he agreed to tell his story. And the world finally learned how close it had come to ending. The reaction was extraordinary. People around the world were shocked. How could this have happened? How could we have come so close to nuclear war without knowing? And how could the man who prevented it have been treated so poorly? Awards and recognition finally began to come. In 2004, the Association of World Citizens gave Petrov an award at the United Nations. In 2006, he was honored at a special ceremony in New York. In 2013, he received the Dresden Prize. But Petrov remained modest about his actions. In interviews, he consistently downplayed what he had done. "I was just doing my job," he would say. "I didn't want to make a mistake." When asked if he felt like a hero, he said, "No, I was just in the right place at the right time. I'm not a hero. I was simply doing my job, and I was just fortunate enough to make the right decision." But others saw it differently. As one historian put it, Petrov's decision stands as one of the single most important acts of any individual in history. His judgment call prevented what might have been the end of human civilization. The story of September 26, 1983, also forced a reckoning with nuclear weapons policy. People began asking uncomfortable questions. If a false alarm could nearly trigger World War III, what other close calls had there been? How many times had we been lucky? The answer, it turned out, was disturbing. September 26th wasn't the only close call. There had been others. In 1979, a training tape accidentally loaded into the U.S. early warning system caused a false alarm of Soviet missile attack. In 1980, a computer chip failure created another false alarm. In 1995, Russian radar mistook a Norwegian research rocket for a nuclear missile. Each time, disaster was averted by narrow margins, by someone asking questions, by someone hesitating just long enough to verify. by luck. The nuclear weapons that brought us so close to annihilation are still here. Today, the United States and Russia still maintain thousands of nuclear warheads, many on high alert, ready to launch within minutes of a decision to fire. The technology is more sophisticated now. The computer systems are more advanced, but they're still vulnerable to malfunction, to misinterpretation, to human error. And the fundamental problem remains. When you have only minutes to decide whether to launch nuclear weapons in response to an attack, there's almost no time to verify, to check, to question. There's barely time to think.
Stanislav Petrov died on May 19, 2017, at the age of 77. He died in that same small apartment outside Moscow, still living on his modest pension. His death went unnoticed for several months until a friend tried to contact him. When the world finally learned of his death, there was an outpouring of tributes. Political leaders, peace activists, historians, and ordinary people from around the world expressed their gratitude for the man who had saved them without their knowledge. The United Nations Secretary General issued a statement. The Kremlin, which had once suppressed his story, now acknowledged his service. Newspapers around the world published obituaries calling him the man who saved the world. But Petrov's story is about more than just one man's courage. It's about the systems we've built and the risks we continue to take with human survival. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union operated on a principle called launch on warning. This meant that if early warning systems detected an enemy missile attack, the response would be to immediately launch a massive retaliatory strike before the enemy missiles could destroy your own missiles in their silos. This policy was designed to maintain deterrence. If the enemy knew you could and would retaliate even if they struck first, they wouldn't dare attack. Mutually assured destruction would keep the peace. But launch on warning created an enormous risk. It meant that a false alarm could trigger World War III. It meant that the decision to end human civilization might be made not after careful deliberation, but in a few panicked minutes based on incomplete information. And it meant that the fate of the world could rest on the judgment of individual officers like Stanislav Petrov. Men and women who were supposed to follow procedures, to trust their systems, to obey orders. People who might not have the courage or the wisdom to question what their computers were telling them. Petrov was one of the lucky ones. Lucky for him, lucky for us. He had the technical knowledge to understand the system's weaknesses. He had the critical thinking skills to question the data. He had the courage to trust his instincts over his orders, and he had the moral strength to take responsibility for a decision that could have ended his career, or worse. But what about the next time? What about the next officer who faces a similar situation? Will they have Petrov's wisdom, his courage, his willingness to question authority? The nuclear arsenals that threatened the world in 1983 are still with us. They're somewhat smaller than they were at the height of the Cold War, but they're still massive. The United States has about 5,500 nuclear warheads. Russia has about 6,000. France, China, the United Kingdom, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea also have nuclear weapons. Many of these weapons are still on high alert. They can be launched within minutes. The early warning systems are more sophisticated, but they're still not perfect. They're still vulnerable to technical malfunctions, to cyber attacks, to misinterpretation of data. And new tensions are rising. Relations between the United States and Russia have deteriorated in recent years. New nuclear powers have emerged. The international agreements that once limited nuclear weapons are breaking down. We are not safer today than we were on September 26, 1983. In some ways, we may be more vulnerable. The weapons are more powerful.
The delivery systems are faster, the warning times are shorter, and the number of countries with nuclear weapons has increased, multiplying the chances for miscalculation or accident. Petrov's story is a warning. It shows us how fragile our safety is, how much we depend on technology that can fail, and on individuals who might not always make the right choice. But it's also a story of hope. It shows us that even in the most dangerous situations, human wisdom can prevail over fear and over machine logic. It shows us that individuals matter, that courage matters, that thinking critically and questioning authority can literally save the world.
Stanislav Petrov is the most famous example, but he wasn't the only person who prevented nuclear catastrophe through individual judgment. There were others, heroes whose names we should know. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was trapped by American destroyers. The submarine was out of contact with Moscow. The captain didn't know if war had already begun. The Americans were dropping practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface. Inside the submarine, conditions were desperate. The temperature was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was toxic. The crew was near collapse. Captain Valentin Savitsky decided to fire the submarine's nuclear torpedo. Soviet procedure required the agreement of 3 officers to launch a nuclear weapon. The captain agreed. The political officer agreed. But the second-in-command, Vasily Arkyupov, refused. He convinced the captain to surface instead. If that submarine had launched its nuclear torpedo and sunk American destroyers, it would almost certainly have triggered World War III. Arkyupov's decision may have been as important as Petrov's, yet most people have never heard his name. In November 1983, just 2 months after Petrov's incident, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. It was a practice drill for releasing nuclear weapons. But Soviet intelligence, already on edge from Operation Ryan, interpreted the exercise as cover for an actual first strike. The KGB sent urgent warnings to Moscow. Soviet nuclear forces went on high alert. Bombers were fueled and loaded with nuclear weapons. Missile crews were placed on maximum readiness. For several days, the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of launching a preemptive strike. The crisis was diffused when the exercise ended and Western intelligence agencies realized how dangerously the Soviets had misinterpreted it. But it was another terrifyingly close call. In January 1995, Russian radar detected what appeared to be a submarine-launched missile heading for Moscow. President Boris Yeltsin was awakened and presented with the nuclear briefcase. He had less than 10 minutes to decide whether to order a retaliatory strike. For the first time in history, a Russian president activated the nuclear briefcase. The launch codes were ready. Missiles were prepared to fire. But Yeltsin waited. He wanted confirmation. The missile turned out to be a weather balloon. If Yeltsin had been more impulsive, or if the Russian command structure had been more rigid, World War III might have started over a weather balloon. These incidents show us that the threat of accidental nuclear war is not theoretical. It's real. It's happened multiple times. And each time, we've survived only because of individual human judgment, hesitation, wisdom, or dumb luck. How many times can we roll the dice before our luck runs out? On September 26, 1983, the world didn't end, but it could have. It almost did. And the only thing that prevented it was one man's decision to trust his instincts over a computer. We can't rely on being that lucky again. The existence of nuclear weapons poses an existential threat to human civilization. As long as these weapons exist, as long as they're on high alert, as long as decisions about their use must be made in minutes rather than hours or days, we remain vulnerable to catastrophe. Stanislav Petrov's legacy should be a call to action, not just to honor him, though he deserves that, but to recognize the insanity of the situation he was placed in. to acknowledge that we cannot continue to place the fate of human civilization in the hands of early warning systems that can malfunction and individual officers who might not have the wisdom to question them. The night the world almost ended should remind us that the night the world actually ends could be any night. It could be tonight. It could be tomorrow. It could be any time that technology fails, or human judgment fails, or luck simply runs out. Petrov showed us that individuals can make a difference, that courage and wisdom can change the course of history, that the human spirit, at its best, can overcome fear and prevent catastrophe. But we shouldn't have to depend on individual heroes. We shouldn't have to rely on luck. The real lesson of September 26, 1983, is that we need to change the system. We need to reduce nuclear arsenals. We need to take weapons off high alert. We need to create safeguards and verification systems that give decision-makers time to think, to verify, to question.
We need to step back from the brink, because the next time the alarm goes off, we might not have another Stanislav Petrov to save us. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more Cold War history.